If that shrew gets a single dollar from my father's estate, I'll challenge the will in court, my son Daniel shouted across the conference table, loud enough that even the receptionist outside the glass office probably heard him. The words hung in the air like something sour. No one moved. No one spoke. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the soft ticking of a clock on the wall behind the lawyer's desk. I folded my hands in my lap and looked at my son. Daniel Whitmore was 45 years old, tall like his father, with the same dark hair that had once made strangers say they were identical. But the resemblance stopped there. His father had always carried himself with quiet patience, the kind of calm that filled a room without needing to raise a voice. Daniel, on the other hand, had inherited none of that steadiness. He stood beside the polished oak table, shoulders stiff, jaw tight, as if he had rehearsed those words for days. Beside him, his wife Emily rested one hand lightly on his arm. Her expression was composed, almost thoughtful, but there was a small curve at the corner of her mouth that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. The attorney, Harrison Cole, sat behind his desk with the thick folder containing my husband's will still closed in front of him. He was a man in his 60s, careful and deliberate, the kind of lawyer Robert had trusted for decades. He glanced at me over the rim of his glasses, clearly waiting to see how I would react. The truth was, a week earlier I might have been shocked by Daniel's outburst. Robert had only been gone 10 days, and the quiet house we had shared for 32 years still felt strange without the sound of his footsteps in the hallway each morning. Grief had settled over everything like a thin layer of dust. But Daniel's anger did not surprise me anymore. In the days following the funeral, something had shifted in the way he and Emily spoke to me, in the way their conversation stopped when I entered a room, in the way Emily's eyes lingered on the documents stacked on Robert's desk. They thought I hadn't noticed. They thought I was too lost in my memories to see what they were really waiting for. I lifted my eyes from my folded hands and met Daniel's glare. For a brief second, I remembered the boy he used to be, the child who once asked me to check under his bed for monsters and insisted on sitting beside his father at the dinner table every night. That boy felt very far away now. I took a slow breath and gave the lawyer a small nod. "Please continue, Mr. Cole," I said calmly. Daniel blinked, clearly expecting something else, an argument, perhaps, or tears. Instead, I simply sat there, quiet and composed, because the truth was that my son had no idea what Robert had prepared long before any of us walked into that office. Daniel stared at me for a moment after I spoke, as if he could not quite believe that those were the only words I had to offer. The tension in the room remained thick, pressing against the quiet walls of Harrison Cole's office. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon sun was beginning to sink behind the buildings across the street, casting long golden lines across the polished wooden floor. I could see the reflection of the conference table in that light, along with the faint outlines of the people sitting around it. Emily shifted slightly in her chair beside Daniel, crossing one leg neatly over the other. Her heels tapped once against the floor, a small, impatient sound that broke the silence for only a second. She leaned closer to Daniel and whispered something into his ear. I did not hear the words, but I could see the confidence in her expression. The same confidence she had worn all week. 10 days earlier, we had buried my husband Robert Whitmore after 32 years of marriage. The service had been quiet and respectful, the kind of ceremony Robert would have appreciated. Friends from his old engineering firm had filled the small church, along with neighbors who had known us for decades. Daniel had stood beside me during the service, his arm resting stiffly around my shoulders, but even then I could feel that something in him had already changed. Grief does strange things to people, I told myself at the time. Everyone carries loss differently, but the days after the funeral began to reveal something deeper than grief. Our house in Brookline had always felt warm and lived in, especially in the mornings when sunlight came through the kitchen windows and Robert brewed coffee while listening to the local radio station. After the funeral, that warmth disappeared. Daniel and Emily arrived the very next day with 2 large suitcases, saying they wanted to help me organize paperwork and household matters. At first I believed them. They walked through the room slowly, speaking in quiet voices about insurance forms, bank statements, and property taxes. Emily asked careful questions about where Robert kept certain documents. She opened drawers that had not been touched in years and studied the folders inside with surprising interest. One afternoon, I walked into Robert's study and found Emily standing by his desk, holding a small leather notebook that had belonged to him for decades. She smiled when she noticed me watching and said she was only trying to locate the contact information for his financial advisor. I nodded politely and thanked her for helping. But something about the way she replaced the notebook felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. Daniel spent most of his time making phone calls in the kitchen. His voice lowered whenever I entered the room, and more than once I heard him mention the words estate and appraisal before quickly changing the subject. I remember standing at the sink one evening while washing a coffee mug, listening to their conversation drift down the hallway from the living room. Emily asked Daniel whether he knew the approximate value of the house. Daniel answered that the property market in Massachusetts had increased sharply over the past 5 years. Then he laughed quietly and said that his father had probably left behind more than anyone realized. That was the moment I began to understand what they were truly waiting for. Not comfort, not family, not even closure. They were waiting for this afternoon, the reading of Robert Whitmore's will. And now here we were, seated around the lawyer's table, with my son glaring across the room and my daughter-in-law watching everything with patient anticipation. Harrison Cole cleared his throat softly and placed both hands on the thick folder in front of him. The faint rustle of paper sounded louder than it should have in the still room. I noticed Daniel straighten his posture, his earlier anger settling into something colder and more focused. Emily's smile returned, calm and certain. They believed the future was about to unfold exactly the way they had planned. I simply waited, because I already knew something they did not. Harrison Cole opened the folder slowly, the careful movement of someone who understood that every page inside carried weight. The soft sound of paper sliding across his desk filled the room. Daniel leaned forward in his chair, resting his elbows on the table as if he wanted to catch every word before it even left the lawyer's mouth. Emily sat perfectly straight beside him, her hands folded neatly on her lap, though her eyes moved quickly between the folder and my face. She looked confident, the way people do when they believe the outcome is already decided. I sat quietly across from them, my back straight against the chair, watching the sunlight shift across the table. Robert had always liked this lawyer's office. I remembered him mentioning that once after one of his routine meetings with Mr. Cole. He said the place felt calm, organized, the way important matters should be handled. That memory drifted through my mind as the lawyer adjusted his glasses and glanced at each of us in turn. Robert Whitmore finalized this document approximately 8 months ago, he began in a steady voice. It reflects his wishes regarding the distribution of his estate, including property, financial accounts, and other assets accumulated during his lifetime. Daniel gave a small, impatient nod, as if encouraging the lawyer to move faster. Emily shifted slightly, her heel tapping the floor again. The sound echoed faintly against the wooden panels on the walls. Mr. Cole continued reading, starting with the formal legal language that always comes first in documents like this. I watched Daniel's face carefully as he listened. His expression carried the same focused anticipation I had seen on him as a child when he waited for a birthday present to be opened. Only now the stakes were different. Now he was waiting for numbers, for ownership, for confirmation that the future he imagined was about to become real. I could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes. Our home in Brookline alone had increased in value considerably over the past decade. Robert's retirement investments had grown steadily as well. Daniel knew all of that. Emily certainly knew it too. That explained the long conversations they had shared in the living room over the past week, the quiet whispers that stopped whenever I walked past the doorway. Mr. Cole turned another page and cleared his throat again. Mr. Whitmore's primary residence, located in Brookline, Massachusetts, along with the surrounding property, remains under the estate until the conditions described later in this document are fulfilled. Daniel frowned slightly at that sentence. I noticed the change immediately. It was small, but it was there. He glanced briefly toward Emily. She met his eyes for a moment before returning her attention to the lawyer. The confidence in her expression had dimmed just enough to be noticeable. Mr. Cole continued reading through several paragraphs outlining Robert's bank accounts and investment funds. The details were spoken calmly, each figure precise and deliberate. Daniel shifted in his chair more than once as the minutes passed. The excitement that had filled the room earlier began to fade into something more uncertain. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her purse. She was still composed, but the relaxed smile she had worn earlier had disappeared. I lowered my gaze to the surface of the table and traced the thin grain of the wood with my eyes. 8 months earlier, Robert had sat in this same office, speaking quietly with the lawyer about these exact pages. I had not been present that day, but I remembered the conversation we shared afterward at our kitchen table. Robert had poured himself a cup of coffee and looked at me with a seriousness I had rarely seen in him. He said he wanted to make certain everything was arranged properly, just in case life ever surprised us. At the time, I assumed he meant practical things like taxes and property paperwork. I did not realize he had been thinking much further ahead than that. Mr. Cole reached the next section of the document and paused for a moment before reading on. Daniel leaned forward again, tension returning to his shoulders. Emily watched the lawyer closely, as though the next sentence might change everything. The room felt even quieter than before. And then Mr. Cole began reading the clause Robert had added himself. Harrison Cole paused for a moment before continuing, as if he understood that the next lines carried a weight different from the ordinary legal language he had been reading so far. He adjusted the page in front of him and spoke carefully, each word steady and deliberate. The following clause was personally requested by Robert Whitmore and added to the document during its final revision, he said. Daniel straightened immediately in his chair, his attention sharpening again. Emily leaned slightly forward, her eyes fixed on the paper in the lawyer's hands. I noticed how her confidence returned for a brief second, the quiet certainty of someone who believed this moment would finally confirm what she had expected all along. Mr. Cole continued reading. In the event that any beneficiary of this estate attempts to dispute the provisions of this will, publicly insults or attempts to remove Margaret Whitmore from her rightful position within the estate, or initiates legal action intended to diminish her share of the assets, that individual will immediately forfeit all claims to the inheritance described in this document. The room became so quiet that even the faint ticking of the wall clock sounded unusually loud. Daniel blinked once, then twice, as if he had not heard the sentence correctly. Emily's posture stiffened beside him, the calm smile that had rested on her face earlier disappearing almost instantly. Harrison Cole continued reading without interruption. Any portion of the estate forfeited under this condition will remain under the sole control of Margaret Whitmore, who will retain full authority over the property, financial accounts, and all other assets previously belonging to Robert Whitmore. Daniel shifted in his chair again, but this time the movement carried none of the impatience he had shown earlier. Instead, there was confusion, the slow realization that something had gone very differently from what he expected. His eyes moved quickly between the lawyer and the folder on the desk, as though searching for some detail that would change what he had just heard. Emily remained silent, but the tension in her expression had become impossible to miss. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse until the knuckles of her hand turned pale. I watched them both for a moment, remembering the quiet conversation Robert and I had shared months earlier in our kitchen. It had been a mild autumn evening. The windows were open and the scent of fallen leaves drifted through the screen door while Robert sat across from me at the table, turning his coffee mug slowly between his hands. He had looked thoughtful that night, more serious than usual. After a long pause, he said that sometimes people reveal their true character when they believe no one is watching closely. At the time, I asked him what he meant, and he only smiled slightly before changing the subject. I did not understand then that he had already begun preparing for this exact moment. Harrison Cole closed the page he had been reading and rested both hands on the desk. His voice remained calm as he looked toward Daniel. Your father included this clause to ensure that his wishes would be respected, he explained. Daniel opened his mouth as if he intended to speak, but no words came out immediately. The anger that had filled his voice earlier had vanished, replaced by something much quieter and far less certain. Emily turned toward him quickly, her expression tense, but she did not interrupt the lawyer. The sunlight had shifted again across the conference table, and I could see the reflection of the open folder in its polished surface. Robert had known exactly what he was doing when he sat in this office 8 months ago. He had known how easily greed could disguise itself as concern. And he had also known that patience often reveals the truth more clearly than any argument ever could. Daniel finally found his voice. But when he spoke, the confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. "That clause cannot possibly apply to what I said," he muttered, his tone no longer loud but strained. Harrison Cole looked at him calmly across the desk. The lawyer had the steady patience of someone who had spent decades watching families unravel over documents exactly like this one. He folded his hands together before answering. "Your father anticipated disagreements," he said evenly. "That is why he asked for the language to be written very clearly." Daniel leaned back in his chair, the wooden legs scraping softly against the floor. His eyes moved quickly across the pages of the will, as though the words might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. Emily reached out and placed a hand lightly on his arm again, but this time the gesture did not look reassuring. It looked tense, calculated, like someone trying to hold together a situation that was quietly slipping out of control. "You are misunderstanding the situation," Emily said suddenly, turning toward the lawyer with a polite but tight smile. Daniel only reacted emotionally because he was surprised. Surely a brief outburst during a family meeting cannot be interpreted as a formal challenge to the will. Her voice was calm, but the careful choice of words revealed how quickly she had shifted from confidence to strategy. Harrison Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he reached for another page in the folder and slid it slightly forward on the desk. "Robert Whitmore addressed that possibility as well," he replied. "The clause does not require a court filing to be activated. It refers to any public attempt to diminish Margaret Whitmore's position in the estate. Your husband's words earlier were spoken in the presence of multiple witnesses, including myself." Daniel's face grew noticeably pale as he heard that explanation. The anger that had driven him to shout across the table earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by something much more uncertain. He turned toward Emily again, this time searching her expression as if hoping she had an answer that could fix what had just happened. For the first time since we entered the office, Emily did not meet his eyes immediately. She looked down at the table instead, pressing her lips together in thought. I remained quiet in my chair, observing the shift in the room with the same calm patience Robert had always admired. Months earlier, when he sat across from me at our kitchen table and spoke about preparing the will, he had mentioned something that seemed almost philosophical at the time. He said that money does not change people. It simply reveals who they have already decided to become. Watching Daniel and Emily now, I finally understood what he meant. Harrison Cole continued reviewing the document, his voice steady and methodical. Under the terms of the clause, Daniel Whitmore's claim to the estate is considered void if the condition has been triggered. The assets originally assigned to him will remain under the control of Margaret Whitmore unless she chooses to distribute them differently. Daniel stared at the lawyer in disbelief. "You mean everything?" he asked quietly. "The house too?" Mr. Cole nodded once. "The Brookline residence, the investment accounts, and all additional property listed under the estate remain under Margaret Whitmore's authority." Emily finally lifted her gaze from the table, but the confident composure she had shown earlier was gone completely. The careful plan she had carried with her into this office was unraveling piece by piece. I could see it clearly in the tightness of her expression and the way her fingers gripped the edge of the chair. The room grew silent again, but this time the silence carried a different meaning. Earlier it had been filled with expectation. Now it was filled with realization. Robert had seen the truth long before anyone else did, and in his quiet, thoughtful way, he had already prepared the answer. Daniel remained frozen in his chair for several seconds after Harrison Cole finished explaining the clause. The confident posture he had carried into the office had collapsed into something smaller, almost uncertain. His eyes moved slowly from the lawyer to the folder on the desk, and finally toward me, as though he expected me to confirm that this was some kind of misunderstanding. Emily, however, reacted first. She leaned forward slightly, her voice carefully controlled as she addressed the lawyer again. "There must be some reasonable interpretation here," she said, choosing each word with precision. Daniel spoke emotionally. Anyone would understand that he was grieving and reacting to the stress of the moment. Harrison Cole listened patiently, but his expression did not change. "Your husband's intentions were very specific," he replied. "The wording was designed to prevent exactly the situation that occurred earlier today." Emily opened her mouth as if she intended to continue arguing, but the lawyer gently raised one hand to stop her. "I understand that this may be unexpected," he added calmly, but the clause is legally valid and enforceable under the terms that Mr. Whitmore established. Daniel exhaled slowly and rubbed his forehead with one hand. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked tired rather than angry. "So you are saying that because of what I said earlier," he began quietly, "I lose everything that was supposed to come to me?" The lawyer nodded once. "Under the conditions described in the will, yes." The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Earlier in the meeting, the quiet had been filled with anticipation. Now it carried the weight of consequences. Emily turned toward Daniel quickly, speaking in a low voice meant only for him. But the room was quiet enough that every word was still easy to hear. "You should not accept this without question," she said firmly. "Your father would never want something like this to happen. This must be some kind of misunderstanding or technical error." Daniel looked at her uncertainly, but the confidence he once seemed to draw from her presence was fading. He glanced toward me again, searching my face for some kind of reaction. I simply sat where I had been the entire time, calm and composed. Robert had always believed that patience reveals more about people than confrontation ever could. Watching Daniel now, I realized he had been right. Harrison Cole closed the folder halfway and rested his hand gently on the cover. "Your father spent considerable time thinking about this document," he explained. "He believed that respect within the family should be preserved even in difficult moments. That is why he included the clause." Daniel lowered his gaze to the table. The anger that had once driven him to shout across the room had been replaced by quiet realization. Emily, however, still appeared unwilling to accept the outcome. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the lawyer and then turned toward me. For a moment the room remained completely still. The sunlight had shifted again across the office floor, casting long shadows beneath the conference table. I thought about the evening months earlier when Robert had first mentioned the changes he intended to make to the will. He had not spoken with anger or suspicion. Instead, he had sounded thoughtful, almost reflective, as if he had simply recognized a truth that had been slowly revealing itself over time. At that moment, I finally understood the full meaning of what he had done. Robert had not written the clause out of punishment. He had written it as protection. And now, sitting quietly in the lawyer's office while Daniel and Emily faced the consequences of their own choices, I realized that Robert had known exactly how this moment would unfold. Daniel remained quiet for a long moment after the lawyer finished speaking. The room felt different now, as if the air itself had shifted. Earlier, everything had been filled with tension and expectation, but now the atmosphere carried something heavier. Realization. I watched my son carefully as he sat there with his hands resting on the edge of the conference table. His shoulders looked smaller somehow, the confidence he had brought into the office dissolving piece by piece. Emily was the first to break the silence again. She leaned forward slightly, her voice controlled but noticeably sharper than before. "This cannot simply end like this," she said, directing her attention toward Harrison Cole. "Daniel is Robert's only son. Surely his father would not intentionally leave him with nothing because of a single emotional statement." Harrison Cole remained calm, the same steady professionalism he had maintained since the beginning of the meeting. "Robert Whitmore did not leave his son with nothing," he replied carefully. "He established a condition that preserved his wife's position within the estate. The clause was written very clearly." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. "But circumstances change," she continued. "Surely there is some flexibility in how such language is interpreted." The lawyer shook his head slowly. "The language was designed specifically to avoid interpretation. Your husband's words earlier were a direct challenge to Margaret Whitmore's share of the estate. Under the terms of the will, that action activates the clause." Daniel shifted again in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the table as if his mind was racing through possibilities. "So there is nothing I can do about this," he said quietly. It was the first time his voice sounded uncertain rather than angry. Harrison Cole answered him with the same measured tone. "Your father's instructions were very precise. Unless Margaret Whitmore personally chooses to modify the distribution of the estate, the terms of the document remain exactly as written." For a moment Daniel did not speak. His eyes slowly turned toward me again. The look he gave me this time was different from the one he had shown earlier. The anger was gone. What remained was something closer to disbelief. Emily noticed the direction of his gaze and followed it. For the first time since we entered the office, Both of them were looking at me not with expectation, but with hesitation. I sat quietly in my chair, my hands folded calmly in my lap. Robert had always admired composure. He used to say that a person's character often reveals itself most clearly in moments of pressure. Watching Daniel and Emily now, I could see exactly what he meant. Harrison Cole closed the folder completely and rested it on the desk in front of him. "There are still several administrative details to finalize," he said, his voice returning to the practical tone of a lawyer concluding a meeting. "However, the essential terms of the estate have now been formally acknowledged." Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Emily crossed her arms tightly, her expression still calculating as though she was searching for some path that had not yet been considered. Outside the office window, the afternoon sunlight had begun to fade into the softer tones of early evening. The long shadows stretching across the floor made the room feel quieter than ever. I thought again about the conversation Robert and I shared months earlier at our kitchen table. He had spoken gently that evening, not with bitterness but with quiet certainty. He said that sometimes the greatest kindness a person can offer their family is clarity. Clarity about responsibility. Clarity about respect. And clarity about the consequences of forgetting both. Sitting there now, watching Daniel and Emily come to terms with what Robert had already anticipated, I understood that Robert had not only prepared a legal document. He had prepared a lesson. And the moment that lesson finally revealed itself had arrived exactly as he expected. For several seconds after the lawyer finished speaking, no one moved. The silence in the room settled like a heavy curtain, and I could feel Daniel and Emily both trying to understand the situation they had walked into so confidently only an hour earlier. Daniel finally pushed his chair back a few inches and stood up slowly, as if the weight of the room had suddenly become difficult to carry while sitting down. He walked a few steps toward the window and stared out at the street below, where late afternoon traffic moved steadily through Boston. Cars passed one another, people crossed the sidewalks, and the ordinary rhythm of the city continued without any awareness of the quiet collapse taking place inside this office. Daniel rested one hand against the glass and spoke without turning around. "I never thought my own father would set a trap for me," he said quietly. Harrison Cole remained calm behind his desk. "Your father did not describe it as a trap," he replied. "He described it as a safeguard." Emily stood up as well, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor as she joined Daniel near the window. Her voice was low but tense. "This is not fair," she said. "A family disagreement should not erase an entire inheritance." I remained seated, watching them both with the same quiet patience that Robert had always admired in me. Months earlier, he had told me that people often reveal their priorities when they believe something valuable is about to slip away. At the time, I had not fully understood his meaning. Now I did. Daniel finally turned back toward the desk, his expression caught somewhere between frustration and disbelief. "All of this over one sentence," he said. "One moment of anger." Harrison Cole folded his hands again and answered him calmly. "Your father believed that respect within the family should never depend on circumstance." The clause was his way of making that belief permanent. Emily looked toward me then, studying my face carefully as if she expected to find some trace of satisfaction there. Instead, she found only the same calm composure I had carried throughout the entire meeting. She took a slow breath and spoke again, this time addressing me directly. "Margaret," she said carefully, "this situation does not need to remain this way. The lawyer already explained that you have control over how the estate is distributed. You could still choose to share it with Daniel." The room grew quiet again after those words. Daniel looked at me with an expression that seemed almost hopeful, though the uncertainty behind it was impossible to miss. I understood exactly what Emily was attempting to do. She had shifted from challenging the will to appealing to my generosity. It was a clever adjustment, but Robert had anticipated that possibility as well. I slowly stood from my chair and walked to the table where the folder rested. The polished surface of the desk reflected the fading sunlight from the window, and for a moment I could see Robert's handwriting on the edge of the page that Harrison Cole had been reading earlier. I placed my hand gently on the folder and looked at Daniel. For a brief second, I remembered him as a young boy running through our backyard on warm summer evenings, laughing while Robert grilled hamburgers on the patio. Those memories had once meant everything to me. Now they felt distant, like photographs from another lifetime. I spoke quietly, my voice steady in the silent room. Your father believed that respect is not something that appears only when it becomes convenient, I said. It is something that must exist long before anyone starts discussing money. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the floor. Emily said nothing at all. The lesson Robert had prepared months earlier had reached its final moment, and everyone in the room understood it. Daniel did not answer immediately after I finished speaking. He stood there beside the window with his shoulders slightly lowered, staring at the floor as though the polished wood beneath his shoes might offer him an explanation for how the afternoon had unfolded. Emily remained beside him, her posture still rigid, though the certainty she had carried into the office was completely gone now. Harrison Cole sat quietly behind his desk, giving the room the kind of respectful silence that experienced lawyers often allow when families reach the moment where words no longer change anything. Outside the window, the late afternoon light had faded into the soft gray tones of early evening. The city below continued moving as it always did, unaware of the quiet shift taking place inside this office. Daniel finally looked up again, his eyes meeting mine with an expression that felt unfamiliar. For the first time that day, there was no anger in them, no impatience, no confidence that the situation would somehow turn in his favor. There was only a quiet recognition that the future he expected had disappeared. I did not realize things had become this serious, he said slowly. His voice sounded calmer now, but also older somehow, as if the past hour had forced him to confront something he had avoided seeing for a long time. I studied his face for a moment before answering. The boy I had raised was still there somewhere beneath the frustration and disappointment, but the choices he had made had placed a distance between us that money could never repair. Your father hoped this moment would never be necessary, I said gently. He believed families should respect one another without needing legal reminders. Emily shifted slightly beside him and folded her arms again, though her expression had softened. The argument she tried to build earlier had disappeared. She seemed to understand that the conversation had reached its natural end. Harrison Cole closed the folder completely and placed it neatly on the desk. The administrative details will take a few weeks to finalize, he explained calmly. During that time, the estate will remain under Margaret Whitmore's authority exactly as Robert Whitmore specified. Daniel nodded slowly, accepting the words without protest. The anger that once filled the room had faded into something quieter and more reflective. I walked toward the door of the office and paused for a moment before leaving. My hand rested on the brass handle while I looked back at the two of them standing near the window. For many years, Robert and I had imagined growing older surrounded by family, watching our son build a life that reflected the values we tried to teach him. Life does not always follow the plans we make, but sometimes it reveals the truth in ways we cannot ignore. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the soft sound of my footsteps echoing against the carpet as I began walking toward the elevator. Behind me, the office door closed quietly, leaving Daniel and Emily inside with the lawyer and the lesson Robert had prepared long before any of us entered that room. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, I felt an unexpected sense of calm settle over me. Robert had trusted that patience would reveal what needed to be seen. He had trusted that dignity would matter more than anger. And as I stepped outside into the cool evening air of Boston, I realized that the final gift my husband left behind was not the estate described in the documents upstairs. It was the clarity that came from understanding exactly where everyone truly stood. In this emotional and thought-provoking story, a widowed mother sits quietly in a lawyer's office as her late husband's will is finally read. What begins as a moment of expectation quickly turns into a powerful lesson about dignity, respect, and the true meaning of inheritance. When the son publicly challenges his mother's right to a share of the estate, the room falls silent, and the calm response of the mother reveals that the situation is far more complex than anyone expected. As the lawyer explains the carefully written clause left by the father, the truth unfolds slowly, exposing how greed, impatience, and misplaced confidence can change the direction of a family's future. This narrative explores the emotional weight of legacy, the quiet strength of a mother who refuses to be humiliated, and the foresight of a father who understood that character is revealed when money enters the conversation. Viewers who appreciate meaningful family stories will recognize the tension between loyalty and entitlement as the son and his wife gradually realize that the choices they made have consequences they never anticipated. The unfolding moment highlights how patience and composure can speak louder than anger, transforming a painful confrontation into a powerful reflection on values and responsibility. Through thoughtful storytelling and realistic dialogue, this narrative stands out among memorable family stories because it focuses on dignity rather than revenge, showing how wisdom and preparation can protect what truly matters. As the lawyer calmly presents the details of the estate and the conditions set by the father, the atmosphere in the room shifts from confidence to realization, revealing how easily relationships can change when inheritance becomes the center of attention. The emotional arc of the mother, the conflicted reaction of the son, and the calculated attempts of the daughter-in-law create a compelling moment that reflects the deeper lessons often found within family stories about trust, legacy, and the responsibilities that come with both. By the time the mother quietly leaves the office, it becomes clear that the greatest inheritance left behind is not property or money but clarity about where respect must stand inside a family. This powerful narrative continues the tradition of meaningful family stories that explore generational conflict, personal accountability, and the quiet strength that defines true character. Character 1. 71-year-old white American woman. Widow mother, dignified calm presence. Front-facing portrait perspective. Natural lighting, realistic skin texture. Wearing elegant dark navy dress and simple pearl necklace. Suburban American style. Serious, composed expression. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration. Character 2. 45-year-old white American man. Sun, confident appearance. Front-facing portrait perspective. Natural lighting, realistic skin texture. Wearing tailored dark business suit and white shirt. Short dark hair, stern expression. No cartoon. No cartoon. No CGI. No illustration.